This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. Is it correct? And if not, what are the implications in the real world? I have Howard Bloom and Pedro Marwan who will be discussing this, and that will be in a moment. Entropy is the subject, and I have Howard Bloom and Pedro Marwan to be discussing it. It is considered classically the second law of thermodynamics, basically that in a closed system, energy always order in energy always gets more disordered. And I'm a layman, so I'll let it go at that. And if I'm incorrect, you can correct me. So let me just ask my first guest, Pedro, if you could give me just a couple of minutes of background about yourself, what you do, and anything that you've written about the second law of thermodynamics.
Okay. I was born intellectually as an engineer, professionally I mean, and then I worked several years in industrial companies and moved progressively to research. It was the 70s, the time that computers were entering into companies. I was fascinated by the world of information, by cybernetics, and particularly information in life. And then I started a PhD. I could finish my PhD. It was not very well understood in academia here in Spain because it was very multidisciplinary. And then I went to the States for a couple of years. I cooperated with Michael Corra, and more or less I focused into a scientific career on the research of information, and particularly what is called the Foundations of Information Science. It is an enterprise, an initiative that we have been running for more than 20 years, and now it is a discussion list, FIS list, and it is in one of the FIS conferences that I met Howard, and we had very good report, and we talked a lot. Entropy, particularly it was entropy, we started to talk in a conference in Vienna.
And how does your work entail or deal with entropy? How does it intersect?
Okay, it was in two ways. First, I was introduced during my studies, engineering studies, to conventional entropy of thermodynamics. For say conventional machines. Engines, etc. And then when I went to research, I discovered a deep relationship between information and entropy, and the general confusion of ideas, and all the mystification and all the vagueness, and so I was very interested to somehow disentangle and to look for at least for some personal clarity, not to follow all the mystic of the second law around. It is I think it is very inconvenient for multidisciplinary dialogue create such a mystic and confusion around information, entropy, and all that. And basically, this is my background and my point of view.
Okay, Howard Bloom has appeared on a few shows with me before. Howard, if you could just recapitulate once again in a couple of minutes just who you are and your opinion about entropy.
Okay, I'm the author of 6 books. I'm currently putting together a multiplanetary mission at Caltech. Since 1953, I've been working on putting together the big picture, taking all of the scientific specializations and treating them as if they're pixels, and trying to understand as many of them as possible to see how those pixels fit together into a really broad framework, into a really big landscape, into a landscape that takes into account the entire story of the cosmos, from the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago to what's going on in your brain, Pedro's brain, my brain, as we're having this conversation. And so I've had peer-reviewed studies, or I've given scholarly lectures on fields from theoretical physics, cosmology, neurobiology, psychology, organization, information science, which is how I met Pedro, and a variety of other fields. Why? Not to just show that I can be a butterfly, but to show that each of these areas fits into a bigger picture. When it comes to entropy, one of my recent books, Godless Cosmos Creates, attacks 5 scientific heresies, and or proposes 5 scientific heresies. And one of them is that entropy does not exist.
Well, classically speaking, well, you're laughing, Pedro. Do you want to rejoin before I ask something? Go ahead.
Howard has touched very sensitive points, but too many of them. This is like acupuncture. I have many reservations about how one can make the big pictures integrating too many disciplines. But on the one side, I think this work is very convenient, and on the other, very often there are very fluffy stuff around. So it is not easy disentangling what is at the stake. And I was finding very funny that entropy does not exist, because I think something rather similar to. I mean, we have been sold and oversold entropy all around, and entropy exists very clearly in some limited scenarios, in some limited cases, very clear, very concrete. But all these mysticism around the second law and the cosmos, etc., it is difficult to be maintained rigorously. So I think we are going to have fun.
Can I give you a little bit of background?
Yeah.
I'm delighted to hear what Pedro has. I've always been delighted by Pedro, period. But the idea of entropy began in 1865 with a guy named Rudolf Clausius. It was a strange moment in the history of science. There was an existing theory of fire and heat that basically said that heat was like a kind of a liquid, and that it seeped from a flame into a pot and hot water to your coffee cup and stuff like that. At the time, there was an ancient theory about matter, really ancient, from Socrates. It was a theory that everything is broken down into little tiny particles called atoms. And there was a group in the 1850s and 1860s that made a really outrageous claim that heat, in fact, not only did these little tiny things called atoms exist, but that heat was the movement of these atoms. And that was thermodynamics. That was the thermodynamics theory of heat. And as outrageous as it seems, that theory turned out to be accurate. It has held up the last 150 years. But when Clausius talked about thermodynamics, he gave 2 what he called fundamental laws of the universe, which he said correspond to 2 fundamental theorems of the mechanical theory of heat. The theory that heat is the movement of atoms. Number 1, the first law of thermodynamics, the energy of the universe. This is a direct quote from his book, The Mechanical Theory of Heat, with its applications to the steam engine. And number 1 is the energy of the universe is constant. Number 2, the entropy of the universe tends to a maximum. Let me repeat that. The entropy of the universe tends to a maximum. So you would think, well, what the hell is entropy? And in fact, Rudolf Clausius never really defines it very well at all. There is a key word that he uses, at least in the English translation, disgregation. falling apart. That is in essence what he sees entropy as. You have to know one other thing. The guys who were developing this thermodynamic theory, this theory that heat is a result of the movement of atoms, were using as their primary metaphor a relatively new high-tech piece of equipment called the steam engine. And they noticed that you could take steam and channel it into a piston and use it to make work, to make energy, to make usable movement. But a certain amount of that heat, the steam that was left over when you exhausted the tube of its steam, went uselessly, just dissipated into the air. And that dissipated, disorganized, untapped form of energy was pretty much what they call entropy. So entropy was the fact that things are constantly falling apart. That steam is useful when you channel it into a piston and then gets useless when you've driven the piston and you allow leftover steam to come whistling out of a hole in the side of your piston. Entropy, the equivalent of useless steam, is always on the increase in the universe, or to put it in terms of a different metaphor, if this is a universe that's like a staircase, the time it's always like a slinky going down the staircase from the top, constantly falling down. In fact, if you look at the actual history of the universe is not constantly falling down the staircase of order. It's constantly stepping up a staircase of order. The very opposite of what entropy would predict.
Pedro.
By the way, then there a little phase happened about 10 years later, and that is a mathematical explanation for entropy was proposed. And the mathematical entropy said, well, okay, there's only one possible way that that three of us could be speaking right now from Spain, from wherever you are, Dan, someplace in the central time zone, and me in New York. Highly improbable that we're doing right now, and there's only one way it could happen. But there are a gazillion ways something else could be happening. And the implication is that those things that are more probable are the things that happen, which would be a great way to prove that the three of us are not talking together right now. In fact, the improbable that does happen in this cosmos, the three of us aren't talking together right now, and it's another tendency to disprove entropy.
Pedro, what is your comments then about entropy? Because it seems to me that you're not quite as extreme as Howard, but you're also not in the classical, you don't have a classical opinion of entropy.
Are you asking to me?
Yes, you, Pedro. I mean, can you respond to what Howard just said?
Okay, my view of entropy is that it was very much related, as Howard has said, to what people were doing at the beginning of the 18th century, at the beginning of the 19th century. They were experimenting quite a lot with steam engines and other types of engines very soon, and then they somehow they were all in the Newtonian view of force, masses, so they have a mechanical conception, but somehow heat and work did not clearly exist yet. So they were like first acting, all these people like James Watt, like all the people around to speak I used to teach to my students that the British put the facts, the empirical knowledge of the machines. The French, Lazare Carnot, Sadi Carnot, also Gustave Gaspard Coriolis, they are putting the theory. And then in some decades, the Germans put the synthesis. This has appeared, this sort of thing that the British act, the French put the theory, the Germans make the synthesis. This was very clear in around 2 generations. But my point of view, what I was explaining to my students is that somehow the very ideas of mechanics are developing from the point mass the standard mass to the distributed mass. And every time we were forced to somehow to create new concepts. For instance, for the standard mass, they needed the momentum of inertia in order to count for the rotation. And for the distributed mass, for instance, of a gas, they need something new to account in the way these mini particles were related to each other. And then the thing they finally theorized was somehow to create management of energy and management of heat by means of these distributed particles. And the distribution of these particles were put as the concept of entropy. It's a matrix of the distribution of states. Like the momentum of inertia is a distribution of the standard mass, and the point mass is just the variable, the number of the mass. And then this was like a successive extension of dynamics. So from going to simple motion to more complex motion, and finally to enter heat and to make thermodynamics, you need a new account on the distribution of matter. This distribution of matter is what we call entropy, and it is technically it is very clear and very well put in the study of heat and classical thermodynamics. And I think that in statistical mechanics it is well put too. The problem is with the qualitative interpretations, because there are scores, alien descriptors, qualitative descriptors that have been entered, like order, spread, uncertainty, freedom, mixed upness, chaos, randomness, etc. And these qualitative descriptors are more or less right in some narrow domain, and not in general. They don't make sense in general. They have too many, they don't match, any of them match. And so I think we keep very clear the technical approach to classical thermodynamics, the technical approach to statistical mechanics that now it's very much diversified, and the relationship with information theory, with some of entropy, so to speak, has created a lot of confusion, but at the same time, it has allowed the expansion of the theoretical entropy of statistical mechanics into new realms, very good, very positively, like Sally's entropy, James' entropy, Rennie entropy. So we now can cover technique more and more realm. But please, let's forget all the mysticism. Let's keep entropy well focused in all these 5, 6, 7, even quantum entropy. But in all these cases, there are technical and very well self-contained treatment. Any overarching notion of a spread of randomness, of uncertainty, of blah 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 further, is just to confuse people and to contribute what I call scientific ideologies that maybe they are interesting for writing books, but they are not interesting for guiding students. This is more or less my relationship with entropy from the point of view of information. Information is a pity because we have a big problem, and we cannot present that very technically clear and sound picture that I think we can present in entropy.
I know I've talked with Howard before, so let me just start with one of his proposals where he talks about that entropy generally is not, I mean, things are getting more complex rather than less complex, and he uses that as a proof against the idea of entropy. But give me an example, Howard, of that, because if we look at, say, life, say, as we know it on the planet, it would seem to me, from what I've ever read, that all of the energy of the sun powers the earth. So any complexity on the life is really a byproduct of all of that energy coming in from the sun, but most of the sun's energy is missing the earth. So overall, if we take into account the sun and the earth, there's still a lot more energy being dispersed and being used up than is actually powering life on earth, at least that from the sun. I mean, putting aside little smokers down in the ocean that may be powered by geothermal heat.
Well, the standard metaphor used to explain entropy is the sugar cube. And the example goes something like this. Take a sugar cube, examine it very carefully. You'll see that it's a highly structured little bit of form. It has 6 very flat sides. It has well-defined corners. It's a masterpiece of form in its own tiny little way. Now drop it into a glass of water, stir, give it 15 minutes, come back, and what do you see? The sugar cube is gone. That dissolution of the sugar cube and its disappearance through the fact that, I mean, the molecules are all still there. The molecules of sugar are all still in glass. It's just that the formfulness of the cube has disappeared, and those molecules are now evenly dispersed through the molecules of water. And in the same way, say the entropists, especially through their classic theory of the death of the universe is falling apart. The universe is dissolving. The universe is going from formfulness to formlessness. But in fact, the very opposite is happening. If you look at the 13.7 billion year history of the cosmos, first we had a Big Bang. That was something very formful, coming from what we assume to be a nothing, with no form whatsoever. The Big Bang had 3 attributes that no had never been seen before: space, time, and speed. Next was the precipitation of the very first things, quarks and leptons. Another highly formful, highly well-located batch of particles in only 16 different forms, a gazillion identical copies of each of the 16 different forms. That's a form-making universe, not a form-breaking universe. Next, you had 380,000 years later, the formation of the first atom. That's another big step up the staircase of complexity. Then you had even this what should have been, according to the theories of the entropists, a random swizzle of atoms. Atoms of all the 3 kinds: hydrogen, helium, and lithium. 380,000 years after the Big Bang. What should have been a random swizzle was not random at all. These atoms of hydrogen, helium, and lithium cooperated on a massive scale in tidal, in pressure waves that made kind of music, a rippling like the rippling of a gong from one end of the cosmos to the next. So there was order, not just in matter, but order in terms of social organization, because these pressure waves, these ringing of a gong, when across the universe, were functional phenomena. And then you had the formation of galaxies, black holes, planets, moons. Then you had the first death of the star. You could say, okay, when stars began to die, surely that's things falling apart. That's what Posse called disgregation, coming apart. Yet it was, and it wasn't. It was the end of the stars, but in the hearts of the stars, the depression was so massive that, remember, up until then, there have only been 3 forms of atoms: hydrogen, helium, and lithium. That's all there was. Only 3 elements: hydrogen, helium, lithium, for the first billion years of the cosmos or so. And then, in the depths of the star, these 3 forms of atomic nuclei, hydrogen, helium, and lithium, were jammed together with such intensity that the result was 89 new forms of atomic nuclei, 89 new forms of matter: oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, iron, and all the rest that we know: potassium, sodium, etc. So even in what seems to be the greatest moment of disgregation at all, the depths of the stars, there was an aggregation that was more prominent than disgregation. In other words, the creation of 89 new forms of matter, 89 new forms of nuclei, of atoms. And the story continues all through the universe's history. Then we had moleculogenesis, the coming together of of molecules made up of atoms, then mega molecular processes, huge atoms coming together, then life, then one, then consciousness. So every step, 13.7 billion years, on the grand scheme of things, has not been a step, it's not been a collapse. It has not been a sticky, tumbling down the staircase. It has been some purposeful cosmos, seemingly climbing with unstoppable energy upwards on a staircase of complexity, form, ornateness, astonishment, supersized surprise, whatever you want to call it. In other words, every proposition in science is to be treated as a hypothesis, yes. Then our job in science is to compare the guess, the hypothesis, to the facts, to reality. Compare this hypothesis of Rudolf Clausius in 1865 that the entropy of the universe tends to a maximum, that disorder is constantly an increase in the universe, to what I've just told you, the 13.7 billion year history of the cosmos, and you'll find that Clausius' statement off the top of the head was dead wrong.
Pedro, do you have a comment?
Okay, I want to come back to the beginning to your question on life and entropy.
Okay.
And then my point of view is that if we consider all biochemical reactions, we in general we have to follow that wonderful expression created by the American thermodynamist Josiah Willard Gibbs. Gibbs free energy tells you what's the direction, what's going to happen with any biochemical action. And then Gibbs free energy has two clear parts. What is called the enthalpy, what is called the entropy, the change of entropy, times the temperature. So the chemical reaction has like two phases: the phase of enthalpy, internal energy, and the phase related to entropy. And then life.
What was that word, Pedro? Entropy? What was the word? E-N-T-H-R-O-P-Y?
Enthalpy, internal energy.
Internal energy. Okay.
Enthalpy.
Right.
Okay. So life, the biochemical reaction of life massively follow the way of enthalpy, of internal energy. Entropy, in general, in the biochemical tables, represents from 10 to 20% of Gibbs free energy. So it is relevant in some reaction, but in general, it's not much relevant. What matters is that the radiation from the sun here promotes the creation of, let's call it, high energy compounds, and then life takes these high energy compounds and then degrades them, taking their internal energy very slowly in dozens of successive chemical reactions by means of enzymes. So life is a tremendously good master in enthalpies, not entropies. Entropies are more or less okay and have to be taken care. What matters is that the degradation steps of the internal energy is done very parsimoniously. For instance, when we burn glucose, we spend more than 20 steps, and then finally they go to mitochondria to be burned with oxygen. And this, but life is not only the parsimony to use the enthalpy of the chemical compounds. Life is informational combinatorics, because life is based finally in information architectures. We have sequential architectures with millions of combinatoric possibilities. They can be calculated very well by Shannon, by the information entropy of Shannon and other related entropies. And by means of combination of the sequential information architecture with other diluted enzyme and protein processing architectures, we have something completely new in the universe. I mean, something new that the complexities orders and orders of magnitude above made matter, and it is due to a very, very astonishing game of informational combinatorics that we are starting to understand in the last, say, 50, 30, 20 years, and it surprises us every time. Every 5 or 2 years, discover something radically new. It reminds me what happened with cosmology and the dark matter, dark force. I mean, we are. There are astonishing discoveries in life every few years, and they with the passing of time, we see that life has made more and more informational inventions, and they culminate, of course. This complexity of informational inventions culminates in the capabilities of humans and in general an animal brain. They are very, very gifted to do astonishing things. But I repeat that it is the handling, basically it is the handling of energy, inner energy, enthalpies, and not the clumsy ideology of the entropy guys.
There's a tricky situation here. Pedro and I know each other. We met in Vienna at a conference it was a summit on information science. Pedro is the founder of the Foundations of Information Science group, which is pretty much a worldwide group of very brainy people who are debating information science. Information science and entropy have something in common. Claude Shannon was a researcher for Bell Labs who in the 1940s and 1950s came up with a formula, mathematical formula, that was extremely useful to him in packing as many electrical signals as possible into one piece of electrical cable so that Bell Telephone could send as many signals, as many conversations as possible down a single piece of cable from, let's say, New York to LA, from LA to New York. Claude was looking around for a name for this formula, and I think it was Norbert Wiener, wasn't it? Norbert Wiener, why don't you call it, it's the same formula as the formula for entropy, said Norbert Wiener. And why don't you call it information? Well, in fact, Claude Shannon had not come up with was a formula for information. He had only come up with a formula for the efficiency of conveying an electrical signal down a pipe. But his theory had nothing to do with your intention at the New York end of the cable when you sent a signal into that pipe, into that piece of cable. And Claude Shannon did not come up with a formula for how you interpret that signal once you got to the other end in LA. He simply came up with a formula for the efficiency of using that piece of cable to convey what would be a signal, what could be used as a signal. So it was a big mistake for Claude Shannon to take entropy and to call it information theory. But we so badly needed an information theory. People like Margaret Mead, the absolutely classic, mythical anthropologist, have a bunch of friends of hers who got together at the Macy's conferences in New York, so completely hungry for a way to come up with a mathematical formula for information, for the stuff they were dealing with. They didn't care whether the formula really did represent a mathematical theory of information or not. They wanted to call it information theory, and we've been stuck with theory or entropy in the middle of a science of information where it doesn't belong ever since. So, a lot of other things about Pedro and me together. First of all, I think your formation, Pedro, that the actual experience for what led to entropy was that took place in England, and the theorizing took place in France. There was a guy named Sadi Carnot who came the steam engine into a theory about what he called heat engines. And then the synthesis was put together in Germany, where Rudolf Clausius came up with the the entropy of the universe tends to a maximum. I thought that was terrific. That was absolutely terrific. But we're sort of stuck here with entropy, which, at least according to my work, is a false idea. And then entropy being used as a false idea within information science, and we sure as hell need an information science. Because if you go back to the beginning of the universe, communication has been taking place in this cosmos ever since the first flip of the Big Bang. The first flick of the Big Bang, time, space, and speed, precipitated into the first things. Those were those 16 forms of quarks and leptons I talked about a few minutes ago. Well, guess what? Quarks cannot exist on their own. Quarks can only exist in groups of 2 or groups of 3. So quarks were immediately, we got to the problem of how do I sense which other quarks I belong with, and how do I sense which quarks I should run away from? How do I sense which quarks I'm attracted to? How do I sense which quarks I'm repelled by? Attraction and repulsion, basic forces in physics. They're communicative forces. They're social forces. So social communication began in the first flick of the cosmos, and those quarks needed to lump up to 2's degrees. So information goes all the way back to the beginning of the cosmos, or at least communication goes all the way back to the beginning of the cosmos. Surely we do need an information and communications theory. Surely it would be nice if we could put the information theory and communications theories of physics, chemistry, and biology all together, and of human culture. But with Schumann's equation, that's made a massive distraction. With Rudolf Clausius' statement on entropy, that's been a major distraction. But one other word, and that is sometimes our biggest distractions, our biggest bogeymen, our biggest shibboleths, our greatest targets, lead to the greatest quality of thinking. Sometimes wrong ideas are useful because in taking aim at them and taking them down, we construct new ideas.
Well, let me just ask a couple of questions that I know some people who are lay people who would be watching this would probably want to ask, because I don't want to just sort of go off on a highly technical note only. And let me start with you, Howard. I know that we did a show a couple of years ago about alternate cosmologies, and I know that you have your own Big Bagel idea, which is basically an extension of the Big Bang. And if current science is correct and the current ideas of cosmology are correct, and we started out 13.7 or 8 billion years ago in a Big Bang, we have an observable universe that I've read is probably something like 45 billion years from end to end. How could we ever prove that entropy, as you say, is wrong if most of the observable universe is beyond our purview? Because certainly those stars that might just be a light year or two beyond our purview from here on Earth are still going to be interacting with those things at the edge of the observable universe. How are we ever going to have an idea of energy transfer or the devolution of certain states if we can't observe it?
Well, Dan, we have to proceed at this point only from what we can observe. Everything else is hypothetical. We're not sure that there are 45 million years worth of stuff or 45 billion years worth of stuff in this cosmos. Not at all. In fact, Big Bagel theory would say that the total extent of the universe from birth to death is probably something closer to 13 billion years. So how much universe you see beyond that which we can actually visualize, see with telescopes, see with radio telescopes and visual telescopes, how much universe there may be beyond that is really a matter of conjecture. And how big we imagine that unseen universe to be depends on the assumptions that we feed into our theories. If the assumption is Big Bagel theory, as I said, we are yet to see a total of almost 14 billion years worth of the cosmos. There's probably only another 3 to 6 billion years beyond that if Big Bagel assumptions are true. But Big Bagel assumptions, despite the fact that they predicted dark energy 38 years in advance, despite the fact that Big Bagel explains dark energy, and you can see the explanation in a 5-minute video on YouTube. Simply look up Howard Bloom Big Bagel or Howard Bloom Big Bang. You see different scientists feeding different assumptions into their theories and coming up with the idea that the universe is hundreds of billions of years in size, 40 billion years in size, depending. We don't know. All we can do at this point in our history is all that Galileo and Newton can do. We can proceed from what we know. We can proceed from all of the evidence that exists, and then we can come up with new hypotheses and ask new questions and build new instruments based on those new questions.
Well, but then you're stating, though, that the observable universe entropy doesn't apply. That's what you believe? And if so, then why do you think the rest of the scientific establishment is wrong? What are they missing?
They're missing the difference between religious dogma and science. They're missing the difference between a rite of passage, an initiation rite, and legitimate science. It's the Red Queen or the White Queen or one of those queens in Alice in Wonderland who says, sometimes, my dear, I think of 6 impossible things before breakfast. This is an IQ. The idea of entropy has been used as a kind of an IQ test for scientists. If you can believe in entropy, you're intelligent enough to belong in science. If you don't believe in entropy, you haven't believed the one impossible thing before breakfast, and you're obviously not bright enough to be in science. Now, if entropy is a measure of how bright you are, who's going to confess to be dumb aside from me? Nobody. So everybody is required to believe in entropy, and if I can find it here, I wasn't able to find it as we went on, but there is a statement from Arthur Eddington, one of the great scientists of his time, an astronomer from 1900 to 1930, who was the great explainer of Einstein's theory of relativity, and Eddington basically said, well, if you find out that Maxwell's equations about electricity and light are not valid, then bully for you. Then you belong in the world of science. If you find evidence that paramecium are not really animals, then bully for you. You belong in the realm of science. But if you don't believe in entropy, then you must break down in immediate and total humiliation, because I see no hope for you whatsoever. Now, the threat of humiliation, that's a lot to all of us, including members of the scientific community. And since we are all required to believe in entropy as one of the, again, initiation rites, how many of us are going to legally confess that we don't agree with entropy, or that entropy, that the theory of entropy doesn't agree with any of the history of the known cosmos, especially on the biggest scale of all, the last 13.7 billion years?
Pedro?
I think we have in the last 200 years, more or less, we have a strong competence to what items should enter, what conceptual items should enter into sort of a shared scientific vision, a shared canon for the regular scientist. And what we are saying, in other words, is that entropy is not so interesting nowadays to be an active member of that minimum, of that basic canon for the scientists of the 21st century. And actually, entropy has been sort of creating trouble into this scientific canon, as we have been arguing here, because it does not relate very well with basic things of life. And it does not relate very well with the basic things of human communication and human brain. And it does not relate very well with many things. And it creates a sort of focus that keeps a theoretical, what we call the imperialism of physics. So the idea of entropy is one of the strong points, also with some steam forms of Darwin, to be able to say whatever. I have here a nice quotation from Peter Hawkins. Please listen to me what he says. The fact is that men have nipples is a direct consequence of the second law that drives nature forward, making do with what is available. Have you heard well? No.
Yeah.
We have nipples because of the second law, and this is a very prestigious author, an author who popularizes entropy, perhaps the number one or number two of entropy popularizing. And so, and this is the scientific canon for the 21st century. So it is a pity because with the information revolution of the 80s and the 90s, it was taken backwards by this sort of pseudo-conceptualization related information directly to entropy. And so we are in this long-term initiative of information science, or foundation of information science, we have not been able to break that stumbling block. I mean, we are still caught into 20th century conceptions of information, 20th century conceptions of entropy. People are obsessed and looking at inside life to the semiotics. So everything comes from the science into DNA that should go into Pyrrhustian semiotics to finally the objects of proteins. And it's not a real communication with the world. I mean, that is always related to our life cycles. It has not been conceptualized, probably because it cannot connect well with the usual physical description. And it needs probably new formal tools, new mathematics, or maybe it doesn't not need mathematics, because in our lives we communicate very well and we do things very well, and it's not so easy to put it into the schemes of physics. So we have consensus that the scientific canon should not include the mystical entropy. Maybe some technical parts of it are very clear and very sound, and they have to be kept, but not the mystic.
I love what you just said about the imperialism of physics. That's a very interesting concept. I regard entropy as the emperor's new clothes, as a social delusion. And but one of the things that makes you unique, Pedro, is that you take developmental science, which is a difficult thing to explain to people who are not thoroughly immersed in science. But developmental science is how you go from a seed to a tiny little plant, to a mature plant, to a flowering plant, and then to another seed, and how the older plant then dies away, or how we go from being an embryo to an infant, to a toddler, to a teenager, to a middle-aged person, to an older person, and then we die away. And when you just said that maybe we really don't need math to understand this cosmos, all I could think of was you've seen a kind of an algorithm underlying development that could possibly be used.
I have been perhaps misunderstood, or I have not expressed myself very well. What I mean is that when we communicate, when the living cell communicates, puts into use some specialized apparatus in the cell. It is called the cellular signaling system.
The cellular, what was that missing word in the middle? Cellular something system?
Cellular signaling system.
Oh, signaling system. Okay.
Signaling system, yeah.
Right.
For instance, I have been studying the cellular signaling system of bacteria, of prokaryotes.
Right.
It wonderfully contradicts the basic semiotician assumptions. It is great because it tells something completely different. What is the basic drive of the cellular signaling system? The advancement of the life cycle. But the advancement of the life cycle, like in our case, what's doing our nervous system? It is watching the advancement of our life cycle, and it pushes you by means of emotions. When you are so silly that you see something important for your, say, reproduction, for your survival, the nervous system tells you, stupid, go immediately towards that lady, or escape immediately from this danger. Emotions keep us into the track of the advancing life cycle, the advancement of our life cycle. And it is you can translate bacteria and you see the same. They have this tiny organization that keep them in track of their life cycle. But the problem with the life cycle is not a point, it's a trajectory, it's an ensemble, a very big ensemble of almost infinite possibilities. When we look at the metabolic scale, we look all the thousands and thousands of chemical reactions, there are many equivalent paths that can be navigated. And in these different paths, the signaling system will do something else. But to keep you inside the big ensemble of possible trajectories that give you a life cycle. And the problem I see when I was saying that not the classical mathematics can help you to capture that, because it is too dense, too thick, and there are too many wanted apparatuses to bring you into these possibilities. And so what kind of, I ask to myself, and I ask to you too, what kind of formal apparatuses can you, I mean, when we see what happens with our daily life, how we have the inner drives and all the information from around, and we are navigating the daily cycle, our daily advancement of life. I mean, it is a prodigious feed of information, and we first must try, I think, qualitatively understand the phenomenon, and maybe later on let's look for the math. But now that we are doing, I mean, the colleagues are doing just the opposite. I have the formal tools, I have the entropy, I have the Shannon, and then I go to calculate whatever. But there is no general picture of how the living in the world, and the living is in the world by playing almost all possible keys, entropy, enthalpy, information calculations, whatever you look, it has been entered into the armamentum of the cell, so to speak, into the informational armamentum of the cell. So I think it's a new way of thinking, different from what we were reading in some physics. It mandates a way of thinking. It doesn't let us communicate well with humanities, because humanities is all about narratives, about life stories, and this does not exist in contemporary theoretical physics, etc. So I think we are in a deep gap that can't be crossed.
Well, there's a gap. I think we're beginning to cross the gap. I think the way you put it is terrific. And we're beginning to cross the gap because in the field of brain-machine interface, that is using computers to understand the human brain, right now and over the last 10 years, the scientists in that field have been trying to get a computer to read your brain so that it knows, the computer knows, when you want to reach your hand out and pick up a cup of coffee. Why? Because if you've been paralyzed from the neck on down for the last 5 years of your life, you have had to give up on ever reaching out and picking up another cup of coffee again. But if the computer can read your brain and see when you want to reach out for a cup of coffee, it can operate a mechanical arm, you can get that ability to pick up a cup of coffee back. And to achieve this, the computer scientists, the BMI scientists, the brain-machine interface scientists, have abandoned the attempt to use existing mathematical formulae to understand the brain, and have instead used deep learning. In other words, they've had the computer observe your brain so much, taking so much of what you've just characterized as qualitative information, that the computer can make generalizations that none of the scientists can make. And it can, over the course of time, learn when you indeed want to reach out and pick up a cup of coffee with your left hand. And it's working. And Elon Musk, in the last few days, has just purchased a firm in this area so that this qualitative approach to the brain, the qualitative approach based on mathematics too complex for any individual human to understand. He sees the future in that. He sees the future in friendship that will allow me to read your mind and you to read mine. But it's based on what you just said, qualitative approaches, rather than presuppositions about what formula you have to impose on a reality that, in fact, does not use that formula. In other words, it's a rebellion against what you just called the imperialism of physics. The imperialism simplistic equation.
Okay, I can hardly argue with you. I like what you have said. Although I would like to make a couple of points. We have in the order of 6,000 specialized scientific disciplines in the contemporary system of sciences. I don't want to imply at all that these 6,000 scientific disciplines are silly. I mean, there are very clever people in many places doing very clever things. And what I have said from you, it's one of these clever branches, one of 6,000 fields that they are doing very interesting things in a very convenient direction. But what we are talking here is sort of an exception. I mean, you know very well that in general, conversations are very different. The dominant canon or the dominant vision of the whole system of knowledge today is far from this. And this is very influential. The dominant views are very influential, and I think that socially, globally, and in the scientific enterprise as a whole, the gap is terrible. Terrible. And achievements from some specialized field do not transcend, do not change the dominant way of thinking, and do not cross-pollinate or cross, how do you say?
Correspond.
Yeah, they do not intermix, they do not play the multidisciplinary game. I think that we have to change many things in the way we look at the whole scientific enterprise, how the disciplines communicate, how the scientific canon of the different scientific canons, what do they contain? And I think I am amazed that when we talk about many things of society, we still use the metaphors of force, social forces, social markets. I mean, we see the mechanistic conceptions are so much entrenched, and we similarly we live in the society of information, society of knowledge. And finally, the old imperialism is alive and well. And as you were saying, Howard, how you were saying it is the emperor has no clothes. But
what I'm trying to do,
it's the power. It has no clothes, but it has the power.
I'm trying to give 16 to 20-year-olds a gift, and that gift is a field called omnology. And omnology as in the aspiration to omniscience, to knowing everything. And the goal of omniscience or omnology is to say to a sophomore in college, when he realizes or she realizes that he or she is interested in art history, in neurobiology, and in film. And a wise parent is going to sit that poor kid down and say, look, schmuck, make up your mind. Are you going to be an art historian, or are you going to be a neurobiologist, or are you going to be a filmmaker? Until you've made up your mind, you're nothing. Well, omnology is there to say, hey, you have three really strong curiosities. You love art history, you love neurobiology, you love filmmaking. Follow every single one of those curiosities simultaneously. Follow them as long as they remain exciting to you. If new curiosities excite you, rouse your passions, follow them too. And when your peers are coming back, are hitting the age of midlife crisis, the age of 40, and they're wondering why they are on planet Earth to begin with, and they're buying little red sports cars and picking blondes and cheating on their wives, give them some sense of meaning in this universe, you will be just coming back from the wilderness of your three simultaneous curiosities with answers to questions nobody else has. You will just be coming back with the gift of your unique insights, and it will be the beginning of your life, the beginning of your career when you're 40, not the end of a life and career to be for your friends. So that's the gift I'm trying to give kids today, tomorrow, and after I'm one of them anyway.
Well, let me wrap.
It's very much in keeping, because you, Pedro, are an apologist, because you keep your feet in about 4 different disciplines simultaneously, and it is terrific. It's a gift.
Well, let me sort of wrap this show up. I want to just ask one final question regarding entropy, and then I'll let you both give any closing remarks and anything else you have going on in the future. I wanted to end with another question that probably a lot of lay people would ask, and that is that since it's generally accepted that a universal expansion has been going on since the Big Bang, and when we say universal expansion, this isn't just more matter being created, this is space-time itself being created, supposedly. Does not that, one, itself violate entropy in that we're creating space-time just continually, and two, that added space-time is going to have potential energy, so doesn't that imply that the cosmos as we know it is not a closed or isolated system, and therefore there's really no way to test entropy against that? So a two-part thing. Let me start with Howard, and then I'll ask Pedro.
Okay, whenever the entropists have an unusual ploy, they have an astonishing escape mechanism. And the escape mechanism, when you get them cornered, is this. Oh, but you're just talking about closed systems. In open systems, blah, 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 blah. Or you're just talking about open systems and closed systems. Guess what? That idea of open and closed systems is an escape device that is a part of the theory of entropy. So entropists try to save themselves from a corner from which they cannot escape by using, guess what? The theory of entropy, and pretending that it is a part of something much bigger than the theory of entropy. No, it's not. Closed systems, forget about closed systems. Forget about open systems. The question is entropy on, or does entropy in the universe tend to a maximum? Is Rudolf Clausius correct? And if he's wrong, it may be time to abandon this. And if we abandon the concept of entropy, it may give us a lot of extra energy to focus on something else. The book in which I covered this is The God Problem, How a Godless Cosmos Creates. How in the world did a godless cosmos, and I'm an atheist, so I believe that this is a godless cosmos, how in the world did a godless cosmos create a Big Bang? How in the world did that Big Bang explode with 3 things that had never existed before, space, time, and speed? How in the world did a godless cosmos create the first things, quarks and leptons? How did the godless cosmos evolve galaxies, black holes, planets, and moons? How did this cosmos create life? How did life generate mind, consciousness, and whatever is beyond us? Those are really big questions. And we've spent 150 years fiddling about this impossible proposition called entropy that doesn't fit any of the facts whatsoever. It's time to relocate, to re-aim our energies, focus on how this cosmos manages to pull off supersized surprise after supersized surprise after supersized surprise. Idea of entropy is getting in our way.
Pedro, what is your thoughts about universal expansion and entropy?
Yeah, well, I have always very much intrigued, not about the cosmological expansion, but what happens at the Planck scale. I think this is 10 exponential minus 30 something. And then at the quantum scale, all the quantum equations make no sense, and something very curious happens. We enter into a string theory and superstring theory. But what matters is that the vacuum is not vacuum anymore. It is a territory of generativity. Everything happens because we are not abiding by the uncertainty. I mean, there is creation, very short, tiny escapes of time. I very tiny scales of space, but the generativity is enormous. It is connected with the basic properties of the quantum scale and the macroscopic world. But this quantum generativity, for me, it's amazing because it implies like if the cosmos. I see the cosmos, the vacuum, as a sort of enormous field of ribosomes. Every grain of space-time at the scale of the Planck scale, because like a ribosome, I see the cosmos like a living organism, and then they are churning matter, churning existence out from this distributed network of productivity. And then I think there is something that physicists do not talk about. What are the laws of nature? Where are the laws of nature? How laws of nature may interact with matter, with ordinary matter? And then they don't care to tell where in the cosmos are laws, because anything actuated on matter has to be material. We don't accept immaterial activity, actuation. And this is one of the first postulates of physics. I mean, the physicality of the mechanism, but never they try to associate the structure, the material structure of physical laws themselves. And I think at the generativity of the vacuum at the Planck scale, physicists are obliged to give a scheme on how laws of nature and generativity of nature occur. Once do that, I will listen to all the other speculations on cosmology, etc. I think that most of the present speculations are based on schemes of another time. I mean, they are not really exciting and interesting. It's like Hawking and Bekenstein ideas on black holes and information on black holes. I mean, this is not really. I think they are bright minds looking at not so interesting problems. But I really demand to physicists, where are physical laws so that they interact and they touch matter, so to speak? Where are they? I have asked to several physicists, nobody answered me, and they reject the question. It's an illegitimate question for them.
Well, I will link to both Howard's website, howardbloom.net, and Pedro's webpage below. Anyone who's enjoyed this conversation can contact them. Let me just ask both of you, and I'll start with Pedro, just some final comments. And do you have any work or any papers or any books or any, what are you working on currently now, Pedro?
I am a professional scientist. I work in medical research, and I spend quite a lot of time doing strange research that I am not very much interested in. But okay, I try to work in signaling systems. I am cooperating in a topodynamic approach to brain dynamics, the new neural entropy, but in a different way. And also we are studying, and I think this can be interesting, the informational nature of the person. I mean, we call it the sociotype. I mean, what are your daily needs of interaction? How much time do you speak? How many friends do you have? What is your preferred family size? How many friends do you have? How many times every day do you need to speak on average? And how many times do you laugh every day on average? Very curious question. Do you know that laughing is the best predictor of human health?
Yeah.
How many times do you laugh per day? It's the best predictor of your health state. And I mean, I am amazed that so basic things of life, of information, of molecular, of bacteria, of humans. I mean, our science is paying a big penalty in being managed from outdated ideas, I think. And I think the world is suffering so many serious problems in very wrong in sustainability, in politics, and conflict with religion, the conflict between countries, in part because science is not providing adequate, interesting, guiding ideas for people to behave, for people to communicate, for social organizations, etc. So we need a scientific revolution. That's my stance, my modest stance.
Well, thank you. Howard, if you have a final comment on entropy, and then what's your next book going to be?
Well, it's. I think we've said what we need to say about entropy.
Okay.
The time has come to use it the way we use other discarded elements and stand on it in order to stand higher. But the book covers the subject as the God problem, what God this cosmos creates. And I think it's a terrific book, but how do I know I'm the author? So I'm biased. I have another book that's just come out called The Muhammad Code, How a Desert Prophet Brought You ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram. And you might think, what does this have to do? What does Muhammad have to do with any of this? Everything in the world. I've been on a scientific quest for the forces of history for over 60 years, and this is definitely a major piece of that. And then I have a book coming out in roughly August or July called How I Accepted Belief Started in the 60s, that Timothy Leary said is a monumental masterpiece of American literature, and it has been named the official book of the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love. That plus my multi-planetary mission at Caltech, those are the I'm focused on. Pedro is focused on. We are focused on trying to give you tools with which to see both yourself and the cosmos in ways you've never foreseen before. That's our task.
Well, I want to thank both of you, and thanks for a good show.